Welcome, everyone. Thanks very much for joining us today and coming out to SFU's Big Data Hub. My name's Fred Popowich. I'm the Executive Director here at KEY, SFU's Big Data Initiative. And feel free to remember to turn your phones onto vibrate, but to keep them on so that you can join in the conversation over Twitter using the hashtags SFUKey and the hashtag Data Visionaries. So I have the pleasure to welcome you to our second Data Visionaries talk of this series. For those of you joining us for the first time, the Data Visionaries series is dedicated to bringing together pioneers in the field who are shaping and reshaping the world we live in. Data is changing our society, and KEY's not afraid to ask the hard questions about what we should and shouldn't do with data. So one area in particular where we grapple with these questions is in the field of journalism. We face, for some reason, an increased awareness of fake news, diversified platforms for consuming and sharing content, and it seems like an unrelenting stream of data that we have to make sense of. So the data, as we'll see in this series and even today, needs context and some nuanced questioning to support the integrity and accountability of the field of journalism, and to take us on that path from data to information and ultimately to knowledge, and with luck, towards wisdom. But I think I'm pushing it a bit there. And this is why KEY is pleased to introduce the award-winning Susan McGregor, who's going to be talking today on accountability, transparency, responsibility using data for journalism. She's an assistant professor at the Columbia School of Journalism and assistant director of the TOE Center for Digital Journalism. I got the pronunciation of that correct. Susan is a leader in the field whose work focuses on digital security, knowledge management, and alternative forms of digital distribution. Prior to joining Columbia Journalism School in 2011, she was a senior programmer for the news graphics team at the Wall Street Journal Online for 4 years. And in 2010, she was named the Gerald Loeb Award winner for her work on the Wall Street Journal's What They Know series, and a finalist for the Scripps Howard Foundation National Journalism Award for web reporting in 2007. Her work has also been nominated for 2 Webby Awards, and if you do win an Academy Award, make sure you don't leave it out. Somebody will try to steal it, get publicity out of that. Or maybe that's fake news, I don't know. But on behalf of KEY, join me in welcoming pioneering big data leader, Susan McGregor. Over to you, Susan.
Well, thank you very much for that very generous introduction. I don't think I'm a contender for any Oscars, certainly, but the Webby Awards are definitely fun. So thank you so much all for having me today. I'm very excited to speak with you. I'm going to try and keep my own remarks fairly short. I'd love to take questions and kind of have conversations about the topic of data and journalism, both what it can bring to journalism in terms of accountability and transparency, and also talking about some of the ethical issues that it raises. So to start out, just a little bit of background about data in journalism. So data-driven journalism, like data-driven science, uses the tools of computing and data analysis as a means to identify reporting angles and stories that are worth pursuing. So I think something that's very important to me, at least, is that data analysis and data science, big data techniques, are not replacing other forms of journalism. What they really are is they're complementary, right? I always encourage my students to think of data as a source for a story, right? It's a source, it's not the only source. But it has become an increasingly important part of doing really robust and kind of large-scale reporting. But again, it's not something that's actually that new for us. So in fact, it carries on from a tradition that was started, I think for most people, was started first in the early 1970s by Philip Meyer with his precision journalism. So Philip Meyer was one of the first to bring social science methodologies to the area of journalism, to the work of journalism, particularly around elections, and computer-assisted reporting, which grew out of that and remained a very robust practice. In fact, I believe today at the New York Times, it is still known as the computer-assisted reporting team. And computer-assisted reporting for several decades really focused on using documents, often public documents, as a data source through which to do analysis. But in a way, it goes back even further than that. So this is one of my favorite visualizations and kind of stories to tell, because I think it really helps us understand the way that data analysis and reporting come together to generate an insight. So some of you may be familiar with this. John Snow was a doctor in the 1800s, working in England primarily, and very famously, he's very often described as the father of modern epidemiology, right? So the person who kind of invented the field of where disease comes from and how it spreads. And in the middle of the 19th century in London, one of the greatest scourges of urban life was cholera. John Snow had been studying cholera outbreaks for many years at the time that he made this now very famous map, John Snow's map of London, and talked about and essentially solidified his theory that cholera was spread through contaminated water sources. The reason why I love this map, and I have a little zoom in here, so the main culprit that was identified here was the Broad Street pump. And actually this location is still in London. The pump with handle remove is still there. You can go and see it. And so in trying to interrogate his own theories about how disease was spreading, John Snow undertook a set of data collection and basically went to this area. And what you see here is each of these black bars is the number of deaths in a given household. So he went from house to house and collected information about the deaths that had occurred there. Now, what's so interesting and important to me about this visualization and about the methods that he used is that if you just kind of glance at it casually, what you realize is there isn't an obvious pattern here, right? I mean, what we can see is, yes, of course, the residences immediately next to the Broad Street pump do have very, very high mortality rates from cholera. But we also see some strange things here. We see large groups of fatalities at residences that are really rather quite far away. We see that around the block here, right, almost no one has died during this cholera outbreak. So what's going on? It turns out, and this was something that as an early practitioner I was very, in a way, gratified to discover. I'm not a statistician by training. I will say that my own methods have improved in that area over the course of my work in data journalism, is that there's actually no mathematical formula you could use that would tell you what was going on here. In other words, we can see, again, just with basic inspection, that it's not just distance from the pump that is influencing the rate of mortality from this cholera outbreak. And we see some that are, again, even very, very far away. So what did he do? He reported it out. So in addition to going around to these residences and talking to people about how many people had, how many deaths there had been as a result of cholera, John Snow also talked to them about their lives and their habits. And what he was able to learn from this, what he was able to piece together is that in fact it was the Broad Street pump that tied together those households that had experienced the greatest level of fatality. Because in some cases, for example, residences on this street, because of habit or other tasks that were being undertaken, they actually weren't gathering their water from the Broad Street pump. They were using other pumps in the area because it fit in better with their daily routine. And that's a kind of insight that you really only can get by talking to people, by actually asking them what it is they do, rather than relying only on the data in this case and its arrangement to give you insight into what's happening in that situation. And so even though John Snow was a doctor primarily, I think of him also as a reporter, because to me that desire to bring together the sort of rigorous analytical method of data collection and quantification with the context that you get by talking to human beings and asking them about what they're doing and what their motivations are is really what led to, in this case, one of the most groundbreaking discoveries in kind of modern history. So I want to talk a little bit about kind of what we've gained from everything that we have, from all of the additional practices that have been taken on through data journalism. A really big part of this is that it's reshaped the way that we're able to do accountability journalism, in part because we're just able to do analyses and data collection at a scale that wasn't possible before. So just to give you a couple of examples, some of these may be ones that you're familiar with, some of them not. The Dollars for Docs projects is one that was begun in 2010 at ProPublica, which is a nonprofit newsroom based largely out of New York City, although they do have some satellite bureaus now. And this was a really significant and ongoing, I should say, ongoing journalistic series. It was examining the payments made by pharmaceutical companies to doctors. And the hypothesis, or the question really was, how much are doctors being paid by pharmaceutical companies? And the real question, one of the driving questions, which they were not immediately able to answer, was, is this influencing the way that doctors are treating patients? So I think that the thing that to me is so key about this and kind of ties into the next point about transparency is that this is a huge form of accountability journalism. Initially, the way that they undertook this investigation was using documents that were obtained that had been released publicly as a result of lawsuits. So it's not to say that this was all data that was just out there. And I think that's something that is incredibly important, and I think is the part that often goes overlooked and maybe underappreciated about doing work with data, is that to get really good work done, you have to get the data, and getting the data is really hard. The amount of effort that goes into actually just to obtaining, normalizing, rationalizing, ensuring that the data that you're working with is comparable and genuinely describes the issue that you're trying to examine is, I would say, about 75 to 85% of the work, right? So really you spend, and again for my students, as I say, you spend that much time reporting before you kind of even know what's happening, right? Because you have to do all of that work to make sure that you have good quality data that you can then use as the basis for analysis. So you can see here that one big piece of this is that they've actually continued to make the data available. So there was a new law that went into effect in 2013 that actually required drug companies to disclose this information. And on the basis of that, they've actually been able to do, in coordinating that with Medicare and Medicaid payments, which are the primary national health insurance programs in the United States, they actually were able to do some of the analysis they originally set out to do, which is that they did find that doctors that were taking payments from pharmaceutical companies were in general prescribing those drugs more heavily. This one you might also be familiar with. This is a great series from the Globe and Mail that did on Unfounded, which was on the handling of sexual assault cases here in Canada. And this is actually from the methodology from a sort of follow-up from this past December, just a few months ago. This series was started about a year ago. And again, represents a really robust combination of kind of reporting and data analysis. So the data collected here was the result of hundreds of Freedom of Information law requests about how these cases were handled. And basically found, very widely varying practices, widely varying training programs about how sexual assault cases were handled at the time of reporting, and in terms of follow-up and how they were even classified by officers. And I think what you see that really ties these together in thinking about transparency here is not only is this kind of reporting bringing transparency to the organizations that are examined, but it itself is transparent. So I mentioned earlier that ProPublica very often makes their data sets available, sometimes for free, sometimes for sale. They're a nonprofit, so that's actually one of their revenue streams. Not a huge one, though. Actually, I looked at their 990s as part of another thing last year, which is the nonprofit filing requirement. So they actually list there, of course, exactly how much money they've made by selling their access to their data sets. But what you see here is you actually see a very common approach from science, which is a methodology. And so very, very often what you're seeing is really robust methodologies where reporters and newsrooms are breaking down everything that they did, all of the work that they did in terms of collecting the data, in analyzing it, what choices were made, because of course there are many, many choices made, right? And I think the important part about this transparency is that it gives readers the opportunity to, of course, to evaluate those methods, to decide whether or not they think they're valid and agree with them. And I would say that in almost every case with this kind of work, there are often challenges from outside groups. When the Dollars for Docs project was originally published, there was significant feedback from the medical community that raised a lot of concerns that they had about the way that things were done. in that case. In most cases, those tend to be resolved when more data is made available. So very often with journalism, what we end up doing is highlighting situations where drawing very conclusive, very strong conclusions can be challenging precisely because the data is not available. And in some sense, that may be part of the motivation. But here we have the Unfounded series, which has a very detailed methodology. This one is another ProPublica story called The Color of Debt, which is about how debt collection efforts against minority communities in the United States are very lopsided as compared with white communities of similar kind of socioeconomic standing. And this is like a 28-page paper, right? I mean, this is a real white paper that goes into, again, not just the statistical methods that they use, not just the data collection methods they used, but all of the reasoning that they did in trying to explain their findings. So when they found that disparity, they really interrogated it and said, well, maybe there are other factors at play here. Maybe there are things like education that we should consider. Maybe there are things like prior household wealth that we should consider, and so on and so forth. And so it really gives you an idea of just how much intense consideration is given to these methods in doing these analyses. So now for me, the sort of the key part, right, which is the responsibility in data journalism. So all of these techniques are incredibly exciting. They let us do things that were really unthinkable. I mean, if you go back, precision journalism, which I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, is really a classic in the field. It was originally published in 1972. It's been revised several times since then. And if you go back and read the original, what they're really talking about is kind of what we might call back-of-the-envelope sampling and calculations. The tools were very limited at the time. This was before you even had access to basic things like Excel, much less, robust kind of data-focused programming languages like R and Python, and huge numbers of statistical packages and visualization methods. And so it really has come a long way. So too has the amount of data that's available. As I think we all know, as Fred alluded to earlier, there's an enormous quantity of data out there, and it's coming from a whole lot of different sources. This has changed things really considerably. And I would say the area in which it's changed them the most is in thinking about the ethics, not just of how we conduct our analyses, but especially when it comes to things like publication. So this is an example. This is actually a story that I helped out with. I did data work on this story in 2014. So some of you may have heard about several years ago there was a lawsuit and essentially a de-escalation of a policy known as stop and frisk in New York City. That was another example of a case where the data was essentially unavailable. And eventually the New York Times and the ACLU sued for access to the raw databases about who was being stopped and on what charges or on what suspicion. Which, by the way, if you want fun anecdotes in the trials of data cleaning, I'd be happy to talk about that. It was a mess. Suspect City, this story is about an area north of Miami called Miami Gardens, which was essentially what was basically a suburb that grew into a city-sized population during the course of the housing boom in the early 2000s, and makes New York City look like Disneyland. So in doing this analysis, we found that there were almost 100,000 stops in a population of 110,000. Over half of the population had been stopped at least once, almost 8,500 juveniles, and almost 2,000 senior citizens. There were cases where you found senior citizens being stopped and frisked steps outside of the facility in which they lived. I don't have it as part of this presentation, but there was one individual who had been stopped over 200 times in a year. Now, the question with this data was, obviously, it's an enormous story, it's an enormous data set. There is some impetus, right, to make it transparent, right, to give this, again, organizations like ProPublica and others have really helped foster additional accountability reporting by putting their data out there, giving access to, individuals and newsrooms to do their own analysis, to find their own stories. And it's one of the really powerful things about doing this kind of work. So the question for us was, is this something that we can do? In the end, we decided that it wasn't, and there were a number of reasons for that. Partly, there was the question of how to publish it. So this is a slightly different reference. In late 2012, late December 2012, early 2013, this came to the attention. This was sort of a big dust-up in the media world, in the journalism world, was a site called LoHud.com, which is which covers a sort of Westchester, the Hudson Valley region just north of New York City. So this was very shortly after the Sandy Hook kindergarten shooting. And there was obviously a lot of sensitivity and kind of awareness of gun ownership, et cetera, in the area at the time. Gun permit records are public records in New York State and I believe in most of the Union. And so what they did in this case is they obtained those public records from 3 counties and they mapped them. This is a tool that might be familiar to some of you. This is called Google Fusion Tables Maps. This was actually a really big deal when it happened. Anyone who's worked with something like GIS, ArcGIS, or other mapping software knows that the transition between a many $1,000s license to a free tool that lets you publish an interactive map from a spreadsheet is a big deal. But they didn't really do anything with it. They essentially took these records and they had them in a spreadsheet and they flipped a switch and put it online. No controls. In the sense that what you're looking at here when this version was interactive, you could actually zoom down to Street View and look at the houses of people who had registered these permits, right? Now, this is all perfectly legal, right? I mean, these are absolutely public records. But many of you may be unsurprised to learn that people in the community were outraged. They felt that their privacy had been violated. There was briefly, although it was overturned, a law passed that made gun permit records no longer public. It took about a year for that to be overturned. But the real challenge here was that they had taken something that was a public record, made it much more visible, and I think the real challenge was whether or not there was substantial journalistic value in representing the data this way. By comparison, there was great work done by The Guardian UK during the riots there in 2011, which took these considerations very closely into account and did not do this. So the question for us in Suspect City was, how can we show the trends? How can we show how egregious this problem is without running into some of the privacy challenges that happened in this case? And the truth is, it's not all that difficult to do. We chose to aggregate the data. We demonstrated heat maps. They generally were not interactive because for the most part, highlighting the sort of big picture issues was easy enough for us to do and kind of present that to the reader rather than forcing the reader to go in there and dig around and kind of figure out what was going on. But we didn't release the data. We thought about some other ways that we might be able to give access to the data, which included essentially potentially making it available on request. But the big thing for us was that a lot of the people who were identified as part of this were juveniles. And generally speaking, those records are not public. And so our primary concern, while drawing attention to the severity of the situation, was also to make sure that we weren't re-victimizing people who had already been victimized by the systems to which they were subject. So to me, this leads to this idea of, or I should say back to an idea. This is actually this term data steward is actually a term that I first came across in a report by something which is now called the Government Accountability Office. It was then, I believe, the General Accounting Office. They kept the acronym but changed the name. In a report from 2001, so quite a while ago, but not that long after researchers had begun to identify all of the many challenges posed to privacy by the increasing accessibility of data, and especially the linking of data records. So LaTanya Sweeney, who's a scholar at Harvard, had done really kind of the first seminal work in this area, she, using public records and basically CD-ROMs of public records, was able to, I think one of the cases was identify a Massachusetts politician who had taken an ambulance trip to an emergency room simply by taking subsets of publicly available data and linking them together. The scale of the data in that case was minuscule compared to what we deal with today. And even at that time, the pattern that she identified was that over 80% of Americans were identifiable by name, birthday, and sex, I believe. Oh, and zip code. Right? So really, like, not a lot of information, something that's pretty widely available. It was even widely available at that time. Now, of course, I don't think any of us, needs reminding about how much information is out there about us. So they coined that, they came up with this idea of data stewards. And the reality is that as data journalists, we're doing exactly these things. We are doing record linking. We are taking data points and we are finding the people that they connect to. And that's an important part of the work of journalism because, again, to get that context, to understand what's actually happening, we have to find people. We have to go talk to them. But it generates an enormous responsibility in how we handle that data in the first place, and, of course, how we handle publication around it. So to me, there's sort of three key features, key aspects to this idea of data stewardship. Respect for personal privacy and privacy rights. And so this means that basically you have to check your data out, right? Make sure it's good. And that really encompasses, again, quite a lot of things. It's not just saying, is this number correct? But it's also saying, does this number measure the thing that I think that it's measuring? That's really often the big part of the challenge. Making sure that you treat it with confidentiality. So really being careful about who you share it with, even within your organization. One of my primary areas of research is in security for journalists. And again, I don't think any of us need reminding that security breaches can come from anywhere and they can expose a whole lot of information. In fact, very recently, I think it was the Sacramento Bee had an issue with voter records that they had been given access to that were found essentially on an open server. So that's a huge amount of data that was made that was accessible, unintentionally accessible, with potentially serious consequences. The other thing is thinking very carefully about how you publish that data, using aggregation and other techniques. You can even use modeling techniques to show representative samples, so things that are statistically equivalent to the real data that you're talking about, but avoid the privacy risks of actually publishing the underlying data. And then, simple things like just using appropriate access controls. One of the things that is worth thinking about if you have the resources is, do we need to necessarily just put the data out there, right? Or is there a way to exercise a minimal level of control to ensure that the people who are going to use that data are going to at least purport to adhere to a set of ethical standards. So recently I'm currently working on some research with some colleagues in computer science. We were interested in using a data set that had been gathered by a group of researchers. And in their work, they make it freely available, but first you have to sign an agreement that says you will handle the data in a certain way. Very, very simple, not onerous at all to complete. Took us a day to, sign the forms and scan them and send them back. But at least, again, exercises that level of control that means that it's not just kind of anyone in the world doing what they will with it. So to me, this is something that maybe is an idea that can come from journalism back into some more of the big data practices that are in the world today. This is the computational social science. This is a comment paper. This is sort of an opinion piece from Hannah Wallach about computational social science and its relationship to both social science methods and computer science. I can certainly attest to this myself, having spent the last 7 or 8 years collaborating with computer scientists. Conclusion here is that one of the challenges is that the objectives and the interests, the problems essentially that we consider interesting across disciplines don't always line up precisely. And so too, sometimes the question of how things should be handled will have there'll be very sort of strong ideas about that in one field and much less strong ideas about it in the other. This piece is a very brief write-up. So Data for Democracy, which is a data science group that's been working around civic engagement. Actually, they had an event on February 6th in San Francisco. I was part of several of the sub-working groups who, over the course of the previous months, we had gotten together over the phone and talked about issues like privacy and communication and diversity and all of these issues. And it was really interesting for me to be talking about these issues with people principally, some of them in data science, some of them not, but coming at it again from a privacy and security and ethics perspective, and hearing the sort of different way that those things are conceived. And so I think my argument here would be that we all have a responsibility when we're dealing with these things to think about these issues. And I understand that that can be challenging because it isn't always in line with the bottom line. But one of the things that in journalism, journalism is not, in many places, and the US is one of them, is not an accredited profession, right? We don't get a license to be a journalist. But because of that, our professional ethics and our personal ethics are incredibly important. And at the end of the day, as a journalist, you have to make the decision. As a professor, this is something I encounter all the time with students, which is that at the end of the day, there's a judgment call, and you have to decide if you are going to do X, Y, or Z. Do you believe that this source is speaking truthfully? Do you believe that this argument is well supported enough to be worth reporting? You have to make those calls, and I think that level of individual responsibility is a really key part of the profession, and I think that that's something that, as difficult as it is something that I also encourage people and folks in other fields to take on as well. So it's something that I think about when I teach engineers as well, that we all have a responsibility with what we do, for what we do, and we have to, at the end of the day, kind of live with that. So. I think that this hopefully offers a little bit of a framework for thinking about some of those issues, and I would argue is not necessarily something that has to work against any of the sort of bigger ideas about innovation when it comes to technology or data. In fact, I would argue that right now, probably the greatest areas of innovation are happening in these spaces. When you look at the work being done in privacy-preserving technologies, really, really interesting challenges in computer science, in data analysis, that is happening there. So I think it's something worth thinking about, and I'd be very happy to take any questions that folks have. Thank you very much.